Let's take you to this now. The launch of the Global Action Plan framework on informal settlements and slums is currently underway in Pretoria, co-hosted by the South African government and the United Nations Human Settlements Programme. The event aims at starting a political engagement process towards a joint Global Action Plan framework for transforming informal settlements as well as slums globally. Now, let's discuss this. We're now joined via Zoom by Professor Amira Osman, Professor of Architecture at Tshwane University of Technology. Thank you so much for joining us, Prof, and welcome to SA Today.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Now, Prof, South Africa is, staring at an acute housing crisis, and that's been made worse by the recent floods, I would imagine, we've seen in KZN and the Eastern Cape. In your view, what would it take to resolve South Africa's housing crisis in the main?
It would need massive effort from all parties involved. It would need immense political will, and it would need for a lot of the studies and a lot of the advice that has been offered to government over the year to really be taken into account. And so government really needs to transform the way that it views housing. And we're seeing this coming very clearly through in this UN engagement that's now happening at the CSIR in Pretoria.
Programs such as these, can they actually, from a social housing perspective, can they actually help South Africa overcome its legacy of apartheid? They
ultimately must. So while we are here at the CSIR discussing global issues, the applications in South Africa are even more important because of the very divisive nature of our cities because of apartheid. The focus currently at these events is on informality and informal settlements. And from what we are understanding is that in sub-Saharan Africa, 50% of people are in informal settlements. And we know that massive numbers of people in South Africa live in informal settlements, and that's exacerbating and deepening the divisions that were already there because of apartheid planning.
When you look at some of the provinces in the country and how they are approaching, problems that they are encountering, but of course these problems are not unique to that specific province, but across the board. I'm talking specifically about Panyaza Lesufi, in his key role as Premier, saying that, together with the leadership of Gauteng, they are going to be looking at informal settlements very, very closely and seeing how they will curb that. I mean, surely this is something that each province should be focusing on, especially if we start looking at things like the UN Sustainable Development Goal, and how South Africa will drive that change and make sure that they implement, sustainable programs, not only in one province, but across the board.
Absolutely. And my dream and my wish and my desire through my work also as chair in spatial transformation is that we don't just look at the informal settlements issue, but we look at the issue of the whole city and how we inhabit the city collectively. It really does bother me that we look at solutions to upgrade informal settlements. And one thing that came up in this afternoon's proceedings that I think is very meaningful is one of the delegates from UN Habitat spoke about the fact that the terminology had changed. So we're no longer talking about slum upgrading, but we're talking about slum transformation. And that really appeals to me in our conversations in South Africa about transforming human settlements, that informal settlements are part and parcel of the city and they need to be addressed as part of the wider city initiatives. And we really need to find ways and mechanisms of inhabiting the city together. So it's not one solution here or there. It's a mutual benefit. It benefits all members of society, which is again one of the aims of the UN, is to leave no one behind.
Now, that is very important, particularly if you start talking about the safety in cities, etc. Now, just talking about the slums issue in South Africa, how problematic is it? I mean, we start to hear things like, there are 14,000, if not more, informal settlements in the country. But some of those are such that they are described as actual slums. How deep is this problem?
Yes, so I think it's incredibly important to note that the numbers might define like identified slums or identified informal settlements. The number I've seen is around 2,600. However, it also then leads one into the conversation about what constitutes a slum. I know that in inner city areas in Pretoria and in Johannesburg, there are occupied buildings, there are overcrowded buildings. What really constitutes a slum? I think there's a level of informality in many, many contexts, and that needs to be taken into account. I think the problem is massive, and especially in South Africa, because of the very extreme inequalities that we are facing in our society. So this leads, and you mentioned the safety issue. One thing that I really want to highlight is that yesterday, as part of the proceedings, the City of Johannesburg launched the Centre for African Public Spaces. And in that launch, I think it's an incredibly important initiative by the City of Johannesburg. And in that launch, many of the delegates spoke about the issue of safety and how the public open spaces are they are as important as the buildings that we build, because the way that the buildings relate to streets and relate to public spaces and the passive surveillance that can then happen, activities on the streets, activating public space and street edges, all of that contributes very significantly to the safety element in our cities.
Professor Amira Osman, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really do appreciate it. Of course, Professor Osman is a professor of architecture at Tshwane University of Technology, of course, talking about that all-important conference that's currently taking place in Pretoria, looking at informal settlements as well as slums globally and how to transform those areas.